Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, as Jonathan said, I'm a professor at University of Liverpool. Jonathan may have already mentioned briefly this thing here called the ESRC's Consumer Data Research Centre, which Liverpool's got a node in it. I'll tell you a little bit more about that and then some of the retail data that we're sort of consolidating together to create these indicators which we've applied to retail centres to explore this issue of what we're calling e-resilience. Now, I'll discuss a little bit more about that. More generally, as I'm talking, if there's something you think you'd like to ask a question about, don't feel like you've got to wait to the end, just interrupt me and I'll try and answer it as I'm going along. Is that okay? So the CDRC, the ESRC had a program of investments in big data. The second round of those investments was in a collection of business and local government data centres, of which we bid in, and we were fortunate enough to win one of these. So the grant that Jonathan, myself, and University College London are involved in was one of them which was funded. The University of Leeds put in a very similar grant and were also funded. So as part of this network, we basically came together under this single brand of Consumer Data Research Centre as a sort of unified grant, if you like. Now, the overarching objective of the CDRC is to open up retailer data to academic researchers and stakeholders. Within the UK, there are lots of data sets that you can't just download off the web. For example, census microdata. So we've got things like a 1% sample at the individual level of all census data. In order to get access to that, you have to go into secure facilities. There are similar data sets in health and in education, and there are particularly constrained access protocols which enable academic researchers to go and get these data. Historically within the UK, there's been no such relationship with commercial companies. So typically an academic would have ad hoc relationships with different retailers or different consumer data providers. And for that reason, it was quite disorganised and it didn't give opportunities to everyone who might benefit from these data. So CDRC's mission, if you like, is to act as an intermediary where we can provide services to the academic and stakeholder audiences to enable access to data we've pre-negotiated, but also act as a facilitator to get different data sets which we don't necessarily have access to at this particular point in time. But because we know the people in the retailers who could potentially supply those data, and we've got a series of infrastructure which enable us to disseminate that safely and protocols which enable people to apply and for the retailers to feel comfortable with accessing those data, we act as a kind of broker for that. So we're funded until 2019. And as part of that, we've got a series of different objectives related to sort of research projects which are ongoing, which take in a variety of different aspects of sort of retail analytics. We do short courses and training. In addition, we'll be providing these various types of infrastructure and doing outreach events and things like this. So how do we make the data secure? This is Liverpool. So this is the thing that when retailers want to come and see our facilities, I take them into this caged room here, and this is actually now this was pre as actually installing machines. Now this is actually packed full of large servers. Now in the 1990s, this is slightly off topic. In the 1990s, there was some issues in UK academia with Ukrainian gangs stealing Sun Microsystem servers. They were very, very expensive. Now, what happened was insurance companies said that they had to install these prison cells, and they are essentially a prison cell. So we've got one of these prison cells, which we now have cut in half. So there's actually 2 access doors and then a stack of servers, which we now put all our retail data in. There's a private network into this room here. There's CCTV cameras on everything here. You need to access this, you've got like a double swipe card airlock type system. So this is pretty MI5 kind of sort of level of security here. So the great thing is we take retailers in here, I put them in the cage, they feel very claustrophobic and they say this is actually much more secure than our own data housing. We feel comfortable with that we can honestly say this is the most secure place to hold their data. And we have access protocols where if we've got a store card data for a national extent, academics can apply to use it. We have a research approvals process where they can be approved to have access to the data. The retailer who's provided the data, the CDRC, sits on that panel and they can deny it if they think it's not appropriate, or hopefully not, and the project can continue and the retailer gets benefits and we've provided our service. So we have this, and then we do other things as well. This is the most secure level of our service, and we have various other, yeah.
But they come in, they sit there at the computer, what? They can do some queries about data, and then they can take that data.
Nope.
Just look at data.
They can. The way in which it works is they, when you have your project agreed, you agree the outputs. The retailer agrees that they're happy with those particular outputs. The person who's in the lab produces those outputs. There's then a process of checking, and they're signed off. If they're the same as what was originally agreed, they can leave the lab, and that's via a secure download link. There's no internet connection on anything here. It's fully closed network. In fact, it's not even on the university network. So it's just a private network. And then if it was different from what was specified, it's referred back to the retailer, who can say whether they think that's okay or not. The agreement's adjusted, and then it can be released. So at every stage, there's no way anything can leak out.
So the retailers are going there just to look the center, not?
At the moment, the people who could access this would be academics and retail stakeholders. So if you put data in, you can put a project in which could be approved to go and look at it. But let's hypothetically say there was two retailers in the same sort of market. If retailer A said, I want to go and do a project to work out my market share involving retailer B is going to see that project and not approve it. So the projects have to be for some sort of common good that both retailers could see there would be a benefit in that if you were a retailer. Academic projects are a bit simpler because there's less sort of commercial sensitivities. They're more typically, I want to build an indicator of something to tell me about some social process or whatever it might be. So that's sort of our most secure level. The next tier we've got some data sets you can just download. That's just a registration process. They can be like very aggregate retailer data, or things like this internet user classification, which I'll present later on, packaged up in a way which is easy for people to use. We've got a website called data.cdrc.ac.uk for that. And then lots of the other data we have on a mapping portal, which is maps.cdrc.ac.uk. And the classification I'll present in a little while is available to download for free on here. There's no costs or anything like that. And you can also view a map of it as well for the UK too. In fact, it's not a UK classification, it's just England in the context of this particular project. Okay, so I'll start off with a little bit of preliminary about the techniques that I used to build this classification and what we do with it in the context of retail. Essentially, we were interested in Geo Demographic methods. So the reason you have these methods and what they are is that we have things like censuses. It could be, it's a collection of data about places or about people in places, in a similar sense to how you might have a consumer record about a rich data set of different attributes of your consumers. Now, if you looked at each one of those attributes in turn, you could map all of them. So you could look at every single attribute separately. But that would be a huge, huge array of information. So, in fact, I did this with the census. So in 2001, the census data came out here. We use a programmable statistical programming language called R. And you can produce maps like this in R. And actually, we mapped every single variable for every local authority in the UK. So took each one, mapped every variable. But what you end up with is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of maps. I think actually this is just one variable for Liverpool. But if you imagine, you might have, I don't know, 100, 200, 300 different maps for every local authority in the UK. That's a huge volume of information. And it's a challenge which has been, it's a challenge to synthesize that information into information which you can use for making commercial decisions. So a very common method by which that's achieved, and this is actually Richard Webber. Richard, have you come across mosaic classification and Acorn? Well, in the 1970s, Richard made Acorn, and then later on made mosaic as well. So it's his, this idea was his, I think. And this is actually a quote from one of his earliest bits of work, 1978, which I think is quite pertinent. It's about picking out patterns from the detail without losing too much information. So we're looking for general trends that you can pick out from these large volumes of information.
I remember Richard back in the late 70s, I remember him drawing on the back of a napkin at breakfast how geodemographics should work. I wish I kept that now, it's probably worth all the money today.
Well, one of the nice things, in fact, Richard's now very, very old, and he's actually having a bit of sort of self-reflection on his career. And he rang me up this past week, and in fact, he's starting to work on a book with Roger Burrows about sort of the history of geodemographics. And I think it could be a really interesting read. So anyway, that will come out in the next couple of years, so I want to keep an eye on. So geodemographics, Richard's kind of the founder of that. And principally what they are is if we take a city. So does anyone know where this city is? Anyone know that? There's no reason why you would. No. Even nicer than Oxford, it's Liverpool. So this is where I live. You see how green it is? It's lovely, isn't it? That's right. Good for the Liverpool tourism. Anyway, so if we take a series of sort of places within Liverpool, these places have some significance, which I'll reveal in a second. Does anyone know what they are? Well, you think about that for a second. And what we can do, what a geodemographic does, is it takes those places, which are all quite different, and it classifies them by the address. So we find that these three areas, this in fact is Acorn. These three areas here are in a group called Urban Adversity, and this one here is Affluent Achievers. Anyone now have a clue about what these areas are?
Beatles, childhood homes.
Very good. You Liverpudlian?
No, I just guessed from the crowds.
That's no one, it's very rare that anyone will pick this up, but the obvious thing is there's no reason at all why a load of people would be clustered around a derelict house with a guide. But anyway, yes, that's quite right. So we've got one person here who's not a working class hero, if you have a look. He's actually an affluent achiever. So that's a bit unfair, but if we go back to the 1970s, this is the original classification, incidentally, that Richard developed on Liverpool, which is also another nice link to Liverpool. This original classification was built to apportion deprivation alleviation funding. So I don't know if you've heard of the Index of Multiple Deprivation. We have one in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, separate sort of scaled measures of levels of deprivation. And this was a sort of precursor to that, but it used this geodemographic method. So rather than scaling areas from high to low, it was looking at these typologies, which were multidimensional. It captured the essence of these particular areas. So you can actually go and get these original classifications out of the library. They've got some nice cartography in them. Richard later went on, I should say, as computer power sort of increased and expanded from just Liverpool to sort of the whole of the UK. I think originally it was at like a census ward level, and then as computer power increased, we're looking at much more granular, and you can get your classifications down to individual level now, or more commonly things like postcodes or census output areas. And this technique works across sort of multiple jurisdictions, so you get classifications in different countries. Okay, so as I say, the meat of this talk is about this thing called e-resilience. And our interest in this started, incidentally, with Richard, in fact, sort of in the sort of mid-2000s. And we built a classification specifically to look at use and engagement with the internet, called the e-society classification. And one of the things that we did was we produced this portal where we've got a classification behind it. You could type a postcode in, you could click go, and it would give you a profile. And this is just a map of the geodemographic typology. This is somewhere in London, I think. Where are we? Yeah, Ealing. So these are the groups. It's quite typical in geodemographic to organise areas into groups and types. You have these aggregate groupings, which then sort of go down into a series of types, which are more disaggregate. And it gives you an idea of the geography of internet use and engagement. Now, this is quite a dated classification. I think it's still online, actually, but it dates data went into the classifications from around 2000. It was built around the mid-2000s, so by now it's quite out of date. That said, it has been used in sort of policy, so it was used as a measure to assess relative need for government's investment in rural broadband infrastructure. So it has had sort of ongoing sort of utility, although I think by now it's probably not that useful. One of the things that we did when we got this website is we did a small press release. Actually ended up being quite a big press release. It got onto the BBC Technology section of our website, and I think we had something like 250,000 searches just one afternoon when it sort of appeared on their website. One of the nice things that we did is we actually captured the things that were being searched, and also we asked for responses about whether we thought, whether the people using the website thought we got it right or wrong, which I think is useful validation, and not many geodemographics companies do that. But it's something that we're quite keen on. We found out some interesting things. So this is the, if you look at these as the average, so if the search propensity for our website was exactly the same as the distribution of postcodes sort of nationally, you'd have a sort of a line across 100. If it's 200, it's sort of twice, and 50 a half. So what we find is more engaged people tend to be over in these groups and less engaged over here. And as you might expect, it was on the technology section of the BBC News website. More people are searching for their postcode from the engaged groups, which is exactly as you'd expect. If you look at the feedback origin, so if they think we've got it wrong and they're leaving us feedback to say what they think it should be, most of these people have been assigned, which they claim erroneously, and it's probably true, because if you remember, they're on the internet and they're searching their postcode, and it's something they found through the BBC Technology section of their website. They tend to be in the areas which are not that engaged, so that's what they've been misassigned. And then obviously the feedback is in the more engaged groups, which is probably more fitting for what they believe their classification should be. This was very interesting, but we also had the inverse as well. So there was some sort of mischievousness, I think, where people were searching for postcodes which came up as being very engaged, but then they were being reassigned back to the least engaged. And I can only imagine that that would be someone perhaps they didn't like, or their parents, or something like this. So there was some of that which went on as well, but it was a very small fraction. So in general terms, when we're building geodemographic classifications, we like to do it in an open and transparent way, so you know what the inputs are, the methods are. We publish all those. We typically make all the code open source, and where possible, the data is open source as well. We also like to have these feedback mechanisms built in as well, so you can actually just say whether you think it's right or wrong. And we think this is the way that geodemographics should always be orientated. Because a lot of qualitative decisions go into making these, you know, how many clusters do you have? What specific inputs do you put into these classifications? How do you standardize the data? And all that, in my view, needs to be known, and particularly when some of these classifications are used for sort of public sector applications where you're potentially apportioning life chances. So in the context of the broadband example, if we've got it wrong, potentially communities might lose out on access to broadband, which could be quite significant for sort of their economic developments and so on. If it was a healthcare application, it might be, where do we cite a breast cancer screening clinic? Perhaps we cite it in the wrong locations because we got the classification wrong. And if you've got to defend your position of why you've made certain targeting choices in public sector applications, it's far easier if the methods are open. You can say, well, why did you do that? Because this classification said so, and this is how the classification was made. And there's no reason at all why you couldn't remake the classification for a particular purpose. Okay, so this was kind of the sort of lead-in, if you like, to something I've always wanted to do, which was to update this, because we had access to a lot more data. The original classification really only looked at behaviours, and the other side of behaviour, of course, is the environment in which the behaviours occur. So you could be, for example, a very engaged person. You really want to get online, but you live out in the sticks in a really rural area. Broadband's terrible. You might be able to go and browse websites, but you're definitely not going to be able to use Netflix or anything like that, anything with sort of high bandwidth requirements. So in a new classification, what I wanted to do is to capture both the infrastructure, which impacts use, and behaviour, which obviously is sort of the measurement of use and the types of activities that you do online. So a series of different data went into it. So one of them was a proxy measure for how fast your broadband would be. And in the UK, most broadband is delivered over the telephone network. And the closer you are to a telephone exchange, all other things being even, you will have a faster signal. So we actually extracted a telephone exchange database from the Sam Knows website, and we've created these accessibility measures. And you can see the darker colours are further away, lighter colours are closer to telephone exchanges. So it was a distant measure. We built this for lower super output area geography, so we've done that. The similar distance calculations were used for some data extracted from Ofcom, which related to mobile phone mass, because you can't always assume that people are connecting to the internet over fixed line connections. It could be wireless mobile broadband as well. So a similar exercise, distance of phone mass from the Ofcom data. One thing that I like to do is to email people and just ask them if they were willing to give us their data for different research purposes. And it's actually quite interesting that a lot of people just say yes, and you're surprised by that, and then you've got something you can do, which is quite interesting. So one of these sort of random emails I sent out was to a company called Broadband Speed Checker. And at the time, they were, I think there's some competitors now, but they were one of the biggest broadband speed checking websites, certainly in the UK. And what that is, it's a small application that runs on a web browser, and they've got a file size of known kilobytes. You then download that, and then it uploads it. And with the size of the file and the time it takes to download and upload the file, it can work out your speed. And then what it does is ask you for your postcode once you've run your speed test. The advantage of putting your postcode in is once you do that, you then see everybody else's speed results. Because typically you're interested in your speed, but only really in relation to what your neighbours are going to get. So if you're getting very low broadband speeds and everyone gets low broadband speeds, it might very well just be that you live out in the rural area. If you're getting low broadband speeds and everyone's on sort of much better broadband speeds, it could be that everyone else has got fibre optic connections and you don't, or it might just be that your routers are misconfigured or whatever it might be. So a very large number of people actually do put their postcode into this, which they also collect, and then it gives you things like the packages that they're using and that kind of thing. So you could work out if people were Virgin Media broadband suppliers versus, say, BT suppliers, for example. So there was around 7.6 million postcodes results in this particular data file. We've actually done we've done a paper which actually looks at patterns over time, which is very interesting. So you can disaggregate these data both by where they happened and when they happened. So we partitioned the whole data set into this measure of rurality that we have in the UK, urban-rural classification, and you get some really interesting results over time. So you can have areas, for example, in cities always tend to have better infrastructure and are better connected with faster connections. But there are sort of middle-tier towns where in the daytime they will be reasonable, and then at peak use in the evenings when people come home and start using media streaming or whatever it might be, you'll suddenly find that the connections will really dip in terms of their speed. And actually very rural areas are actually have got quicker speeds than that because there's much lower use. So there's a really interesting interaction between the volume of people who want to get online and what they're doing and the infrastructure that's available. And you can start picking out these trends, but we've got a paper on that which I can provide some links to. So that was another input. It's slightly different from the Ofcom measures of broadband speed, which are more typically based on a physical unit which plugs into the wall. So in some respects, they're a purer measure of broadband speed because there's no connection. Whereas these, obviously, people's Wi-Fi networks can be better or worse, and so on. There can be more interference with different devices. So these are actually what people experience rather than what the hypothetical speed would be if you were directly plugged into your sort of telephone socket. So that was quite an interesting data set which went in. So that was kind of all the infrastructure data which went into this geodemographic. And then we had a series of behavioural data. So we know about the infrastructure and the constraints, and then what do people do within those contexts. One of the best sources of this information comes from the University of Oxford. The Oxford Internet Institute have got, I don't know how long has their survey ran for. It must be five or six years, I would have thought. It's a longitudinal survey which asks a pretty diverse set of questions. It's nationally representative about internet usage, behaviours, online participation, civic activities, social networks, all those kind of things which are really interesting. And they started at a time just before the internet really took off in terms of some of these avenues. So I think it runs every other year. So we got access to this data, and we used a small area estimation technique to create estimates for the local level. So we actually created estimates for each area from this survey. So this is, for example, this is just a percentage of households with an internet connection. This is Leeds, I think, actually. Percentage of people who mostly use the mobile phone for internet access. And if you actually look in terms of ground truthing these results, if you think about what's logical, who might in the centre of Leeds, who might live in the centre of Leeds? I don't know if you know Leeds. There's quite a lot of universities there, so students live there, and they're probably using mobile phones for most of their internet access. And when you actually look at the percentage of students, you find that there's quite a high degree of correspondence. So in addition to the sort of behavioural estimates, we also put into the classification some census attributes as well. So the way in which geodemographics work, if you imagine you've got all rows in this very large spreadsheet, every single row would be an area. So we use lower superappet areas, and then every single column in the data set is a different attribute about that area. So it could be the percentage of students, it could be the percentage of broadband connections, it could be these measures of distance to telephone exchanges. So we have all these different data, and then what we use is a process called clustering. And what you end up with when you cluster data is a geodemographic classification. So what you do is you compare every single area in this big spreadsheet, and you find the groupings of areas which, when you put them together, are most similar. So you're looking for areas which have similar characteristics. And with geodemographics, you can build general purpose ones like Acorn and Mosaic. They're designed to capture a range of different things. You can build a geodemographic for a specific locality. So one of the national geodemographics we've got in the UK from the Office for National Statistics is called the Output Area Classification. And the Greater London Authority approached me to say it doesn't really work very well for London, basically. We'd like to do one specifically for London. So a colleague of mine at UCL and I took the data, cut out London, rebuilt a classification specifically for London. So you can actually do classifications for particular localities. And then the sort of other category of geodemographics, which is like this, is for an application-specific geodemographic. So you put into the geodemographic at the start some of the things that you're interested in measuring at the end. And what that means is you order the areas into groups in a slightly different way than you would get in a general purpose classification, which is theoretically more robust because your inputs are more closely aligned to what your outputs are supposed to be measuring. So this is what the geodemographic looked like. And again, it's Leeds. So we can see we partition the areas into these different groups. It's not really easy to display on a slide, so I haven't put the keys and things like that on there. But if you go to that maps.cdrc website, there's a geodemographics tab. And the internet user classification is actually on that. And you can browse it and you can see all the different areas in England where we've classified. So in terms of retail examples, this is kind of like a background measure. You could use that measure for lots of different things. But with the CDRC, so we've got this sort of interest in retail. And internet consumption is, I think, I just caught the end of your talk at the end. It's a big deal, particularly when you're looking at things like catchment areas and particularly traditional models like gravity models. So we were interested in how exposed a retail centre was to people who might be shopping online. And it's driven, and I think this is quite an interesting example. So these are, example of a couple of stores that sort of disappeared off the high street, principally because people have swapped their shopping behaviours to online channels. Borders is one example, Zavvi. Borders, incidentally, if you go to their website, which used to be their website, there's now just this Amazon advert. I don't know if someone's done that purposefully, but I found that quite amusing. But anyway, so that's where all the people who used to go to Borders now shop. So in terms of measuring this concept of e-resilience, there's a series of things you need to know. First thing you need to know is where do people go and shop, or an estimate of where people go and shop. The second thing you need to know is the characteristics of those people. Are they the type of people who would go and shop online, which is your e-resilience measure, so your internet user classification that I just presented. And then the other thing is you need to know a little bit about the composition of the retail centre itself. So if you had a high street which is made up entirely of bookshops and music shops, those are the types of retail offerings which have got a greater propensity to be digitised, i.e. swap to online channels. So you need to know all of that information to capture this thing that we referred to as e-resilience. And this is the framework that we came up with, which is essentially all of these different things here. And what we were principally doing is creating an index for each retail centre, which we could then use to compare all of retail centres by their exposure to these different populations and their risk in terms of their built infrastructures. The basic way in which we work out where people go is a very sort of straightforward gravity model. Most gravity models are fitted for retailers themselves. When we actually looked into the literature, there's very few actually fitted for retail centres because in principle, the data for them are more difficult to get. If you're talking about spend, you need spend for all the shops and that kind of thing. So you don't have access to that data, but what you do have access to through one of our partners, the local data company, is a store-by-store measure of the type of retailer and levels of occupancy. So principally, rather than having spend, we create an attractiveness measure, which is a mixture of the number of stores, the type of stores, the mix, whether there's a leisure offering, whether there's anchor stores in that particular locality. And we create a model which is actually split hierarchically, so we can differentiate between very large centres like the centre of Liverpool through regional centres and then more smaller sort of local high streets and parades. So the model fits for all of those. The output of this, again, because we're interested in putting things in making things open source. We developed the model entirely within R, and you can go and download it and you can apply it to other contexts. So I think I had an email from a retailer in New Zealand the other day who was interested in applying it for their stores in New Zealand, which I thought was quite neat. So you can go and get that. The other thing we do in this model, in addition to these calibrations, are we have, rather than sort of Euclidean distance, we swap it all out for road distances. So rather than straight line distance, we actually take the road network distances and plug those in. And we build it at lower super output area. And what you end up with is for every retail centre, there's a collection of lower super output areas associated as the core catchment of that retail centre. And the catchments for those, if you want to get them, you can actually download and you can view them online through that MAPS CDRC website.
Question, how did you determine how willing people are to go over distance to visit a shopping centre?
The models, essentially the model itself is calibrated on, you have, if you imagine you've got basically two destinations, they've all got attractiveness measures. So every single area in the country is assigned a probability of visiting a centre. So every area, so from the top of Scotland, there is a probability that you would visit somewhere in Brighton. It's a very low probability. And in terms of delineating the areas, we experimented with different thresholds, and it's around 70% is what we produce. The way we built the model, because we allow for the different hierarchy, means the catchments can be overlaying. There's other ways you can build the models where the catchments aren't, and they just sort of dovetail to one another. We weren't as comfortable with that because it's not, I don't think that's useful.
Is it a trial and error process? Or,
Yes, so we've got a paper on this which you'll see in a little while, but the validation we used in the case of Birmingham, we managed to acquire a data set, a traditional survey data set, which we then used to create models and compared them to ours. We essentially calibrated our model against that survey. But you could do that in multiple contexts. And I think a little bit like the Geo Demographics example, the fact that it's all open and you can go and download it and redo it if you've got better data, I think that's helpful because there are, like Geo Demographics, sort of qualitative decisions that you make.
Did you do this in a GIS or did you use R exclusively?
The nice thing about this, well, it's nice for me, is it's all in R and not in the GIS at all. So even the routing is actually within R. So what we do is we convert all of the roads in the UK into a graph. It's a big graph, and then we actually do the routing on a graph. But you can go and download it all, and it's actually very simple to run. So we build these models with our sort of second-year undergrads.
I'm having a difficulty at the moment using ArcGIS, delineating catchment areas in Ireland. It's fine for Euclidean distance, but as soon as I input the roads network, for some reason it's crashing now. Right? I don't know why, but it's just not doing it, and it's holding me up for about 3 months on a particular project. So. It used to work fine with the roads network. For some reason, some glitch within ArcGIS at the moment.
Well, in theory, this would probably resolve your problem, and it's not going to cost you any money.
Probably would, actually, yeah.
Yeah. So you can do that, and there's other tools as well. There's another one that I use quite commonly. I've done some work on commuting to school. It's called Routino. It's a free library, and you can hook it up to R. I mean, if you look at my blogs, I've got various posts about it, but you can send queries, and it gives you distances and that kind of thing. So there are lots of free and open source tools available as well.
Yeah.
But I suspect if you've paid for an ArcGIS license, Esri would probably be willing to give you some technical support as well. So.
You don't? No, they weren't.
Really? Is that right? They wanted some more money, is that?
I actually spoke to the man who wrote the routine. It's a pretty tool in ArcGIS, and it's unsupported.
Network analyst, was it?
It's in fact a specific routine. It's a tool called the Huff model, right? It's called a market analysis tool.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And it was written by a man called Drew Flaker. I don't know if you know. But it worked fine up to about a year ago. But for some reason, there's something wrong.
Yes. So our model is basically a Huff model that we use, but we've just improved it by adding things like the network distances in and that kind of things. Typically, they're just calibrated with straight line distance and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it would probably solve your problem. So I think it's called, we call it Huff Tools. We've got CDRC GitHub, and it should be on there somewhere. But failing that, drop us an email. We'll give you some pointers.
Okay, thank you.
So we go from this. Just a quick mention about what a retail centre is. At the moment, I'm using DCLG definitions from 2004, so they're actually quite out of date. And it's not as diverse a set of retail centres as I like, but that is the sort of best nationally official set of retail centres. However, we have got another project which is almost finished now, and we've created about 2,000 retail centres for the whole of the UK. We're actually quite happy with, and then we're going to refit these models and again put them through the CDRC site in the next 6 months. So your retail centres are quite important because, as I say, the attractiveness measure is based on the composition of retailers within that zone. So in this is actually one of the Yorkshire retail centres, and these green units here are shops. And in reality, I haven't got the slide, there's actually some which sort of fall outside that. So it does sort of broadly represent the core, but in some areas since 2004, there's been a greater degree of change than in others. So you really need a more up-to-date model of retail centre definition, but we've done that as well, and again that's just in the process of being written up. You end up with outputs like this. This is actually a 75% catchment for that particular retail centre, and then you can look at the exposure of the different population based on this internet user classification within that zone. So you know about the retailers who are within that area, you know about the people who actually are typically likely to go to that retail centre. And we create these various index measures. One's like an exposure index, and one's a behavioural index. Are you more likely, the type of person who's likely to go online shopping, and what's the sort of mix of and the composition of the retail centre? And we end up scoring retail centres by the balance of these two measures. And what we end up with is something which I think is very interesting. This is the paper we've written up on it. You can download that, it's freely available. And these are our retail centres, and these are urban areas that you can see in the backgrounds. Now, these retail centres that are highlighted in blue are the ones that are most in trouble, if you like, in terms of their composition and people likely to be shopping online. And they're all, broadly speaking, what you would call sort of clone retail centres or peripheral retail centres, which aren't as attractive as some of the main centres with their sort of exciting leisure propositions. And they're not as specialist retail centres like your sort of nice sort of specialist local high streets, be those either sort of more down market high streets or more upmarket high streets in sort of more affluent areas. And we thought that was a very interesting pattern. And it's very evident around London, but you see it all over the UK. And again, it's written up here. We also had this featured in this magazine, Britain in 2016, which is the ESRC's magazine. And there's actually a nice article on that. Again, this is available as a PDF through my website, so you can go and download that if you're interested in it. It's sort of a nice summary of the classification and the process we went through. And as I said, there are there's these websites. So this is the CDRC mapping website. You've got a Geo Demographics tab here. You can choose Internet User Classification, and you can browse the map. You've got retail centres. You can turn them on and off here, which are these dots. And when you click on a retail centre, it will give you the catchment areas that we use for those particular retail centres. As I said, we're going to update these sort of fairly soon, but you can see what we use for the paper anyway. So that's the end, but briefly, this is all sort of work in progress. So this was an update on what we did in sort of the early 2000s to mid 2000s. I think it's an improvement on that. What we're going to do next is we're now through the CDRC accessing various retailer data, including online companies and other companies who are not purely online but have online retail offering or sort of omni-channel retail. We want to create a series of measures from those which will then input into a new classification. Particularly, we only looked at England in this particular case, so we want to expand that to the full sort of national extent, at least Great Britain. But particularly look at things like use and spend, because we haven't looked at spend at all. So you might spend more prevalently online than you would offline, and we can actually start getting those ratios through some of these large data sets that we're actually capturing. So those are the sort of measures we're going to create and input into these new classifications. The catchments themselves and the measure of e-resilience we hope to improve when we've got the new centre definitions as well. So hopefully by the end of the year we'll have a full suite of a sort of fully up-to-date product which will then roll forward. I said all these things are available through the CDRC services without cost, just part of what we're doing. Okay, that's me done, but I'm happy to take any questions.